Hello, this is Mike Swanson. This is a segment of the Past American Century. Got a very special guest with me today. I'm speaking with J.P. Sottile, who runs the website newsvandal.com and the great email list that you can find on that website and get all the headlines of the day and even more. How you doing today, J.P.?
Pretty good. Good to be with you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me. And you put out an excellent article, a must-read, titled "The Deep State of Denial About Trump's Oily Presidency." It's really something I'm going to read over, actually, because there's so much information in it, and it's could be a resource for people going forward, frankly, because you got so many things you're hyperlinking to. But what's the title of it refer to when you speak of the deep state of denial? Because that's a phrase that's being tossed around quite a lot for sure. Deep state. Are you talking about what Sean Hannity's talking about or something else?
Well, I am, but I am not. I'm trying to define it more appropriately. I've been frustrated by the use of the term deep state because my sense of the deep state is not that it's a number of bureaucrats sitting in cubicles who all conspire to keep a de facto government going in spite of the political machinations that go over the top of it. In other words, it's more like if you ever watched Yes Minister, the idea that the bureaucracy is actually the government and the politicians just come in and the bureaucrats actually control the way the government is going. The politicians are just there kind of riding on top of what the bureaucracy is doing. I do not think that that's actually what's going on here. I think there is some of that happens, particularly in large agencies like Department of Agriculture, where institutional knowledge often trumps, to use a pun, often trumps the political whims of the changeover from one administration to another. But what they're saying is they're taking a term that I associate with something entirely different, which is a shadow government, which in spite of what the people believe they are voting for, actually institutes its own political agenda and sells it to the American people or forces it on the American people in spite of their political will. And for me, that deep state is something that emerged in the Cold War, at the beginning of the Cold War, particularly after NSC 68, the famous national directive signed by Truman that essentially began what we think of as the modern national security state, and then the coming of the CIA, the switch over from the OSS to the CIA under Allen Dulles, and at the same time his brother John Foster Dulles was in the State Department. And then that's when the CIA became sort of, I call them the ad hoc, as-needed goon squad for the deep state. And to me, the deep state is, I think I talk about a Venn diagram. If you have these three forces, if you have finance, defense, and oil, where those three overlap in the center, that in the Venn diagram, that's really where the deep state resides. And to me, you know, an avatar of the deep state is somebody like George Herbert Walker Bush, started out in the oil business. Then I think there's evidence, the Nation article from 1988 in particular, but other things that point to it, like you don't name the CIA headquarters after somebody who was never in it. I mean, if you're only there for like less than a year, we're going to name it after him? Yeah, right. So he goes into the CIA, then he goes into politics. He ends up as president. In the time in politics, he's ambassador to China. He's at the UN. He's head of the RNC. He becomes vice president. Becomes head of the CIA. That guy right there is an avatar of the deep state. Somebody who intersects all of these three forces in many ways and has gone in and out of the revolving door through many government positions and back into the private sector and into the government positions again. And to me, where the deep state meets, for example, is in corporate boardrooms, on golf courses, in country clubs, in think tanks. And it's this, it's really the driving force behind what we think of as American empire. These are the people who created American empire. And I think where Hannity and these folks are going wrong is not only because I think they're trying to misdirect away from Donald Trump's quite real impact, favorable impact on the traditional forces of the deep state and empire, but that they are ironically catalyzing that deep state by being propaganda saying that the deep state is something that it's not.
Yeah, one thing I can't remember where I heard this from, but I heard someone make the statement that any politician has really two jobs. One is to get voters, build a following, win office, win elections, and then the second job is to work for his donors.
Right.
And the thing about Trump is your article really lays out a lot of these financial connections that actually I don't know if I've seen them laid out like this anywhere else, and they're not talked about on television, except and all I've known is like, I think of the Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon, and during the election I looked like on the Open Secrets website and I saw, it just says oil industry and defense, which historically is donated to the Republicans, but both parties, but really the oil industry more to the Republicans. But you're showing in here other connections, even some stuff in the Mueller report is showing up.
Yeah, it's such an odd group, right? And that's one of the things I tried to unpack, because we've heard a lot about the Mercers and Cambridge Analytica and the Internet Research Agency in Russia. Everything is about Russia, but people don't really know that there was a second Trump Tower meeting, and Mohammed bin Zayed, of MBZ, we'll call him going forward, of the United Arab Emirates, and Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, of Saudi Arabia, actually had another Trump Tower meeting with Don Jr., and Eric Prince was there, and George Nader, a convicted pedophile who became an informant to Mueller after he got caught up because he helped arrange the Seychelles meeting, the famous Seychelles meeting, and now he's back again, got caught with more child porn. Probably one of the reasons why he's been such a valuable fixer, because he's somebody that you can blackmail. But anyway, that's a sidebar. They actually said to Don Jr. at a second Trump Tower meeting, hey, MBZ and MBS really want to help your dad get elected. So we've got this group, this guy named Zamel, and his group, Psy Group, they run basically psychological warfare operations, because that's what these things are. That's what Cambridge Analytica does. It's old psychological warfare. Now they call it, psychological messaging, whatever they call it. It's psychological warfare. It's just been privatized. And they want to run a campaign. And this is a company that actually ran anti-BDS campaigns inside the United States, and among other things. So I thought, wow, well, that's really fascinating. we don't hear about that. And when you think about the common denominator of Trump's presidency, it seems to me that the common denominator is Iran. It was getting rid of the Iran nuclear deal. It was putting new sanctions, restricting Iranian oil production. It was about isolating Iran further. It was about destroying their economy. Some people would like to overthrow the regime. Mujahideen al-Khalq, MEK, has done what? They've had John Bolton on the payroll. They've had Giuliani on the payroll. Apparently they have a Twitter troll operation that may be intersecting with the State Department under Pompeo. So who are the people that wanted this? And if you break it down, Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman are two of the leading proponents of isolating Iran. Interestingly, Bibi Netanyahu is. And what's funny is Bibi Netanyahu has been cavorting with Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman in particular. And who else would be interested in that? Well, Russia would be interested in that. Why would Russia be interested in nixing the Iran nuclear deal? Well, because Iran not only has a massive oil reserve, but they have the second largest gas reserve. And if Iran were to ever get into a diplomatic denouement with the United States and leave Russia's orbit, that would be a huge loss for Russia. So Russia had to play a double game. One, we want to be your protector against American aggression, so we'll go along with the Iran nuclear deal because we kind of have to do this because we don't want to transgress our protectorate over you. But then you get to play both sides of the coin, right? When Trump comes in, he destabilizes the oil market. The price of oil goes up because will he or won't he get out of the Iran nuclear deal? And then he pulls out of the Iran nuclear deal, puts sanctions on, restricts it further. That helps Russia, and they get to continue to be Iran's pal without ever worrying about Iran going into the U.S. orbit. This is also a concern of Netanyahu. This is a concern of MBS. This is a concern of MBZ. And this is also a concern for American oil companies. So when I looked at that common denominator, it all started to fall into place. And when you start to look at all the interlocking relationships among those people, with Kushner kind of as a hub in the middle, and you talked about the financial stuff, the day that I published this yesterday, now folks, I've been working on this piece for almost 9 weeks. It was really I say 8 weeks, but it was over 9 weeks, so I had a couple of technical things I had to work on. So I kind of sometimes don't count those weeks, but it was a 2-month process. The day I published it, The Guardian published a story about Cadre, a real estate company that is owned in part by Donald Trump and Kushner, that is apparently also had Saudi money invested in it. We don't know the extent to which Saudi money is invested in it, where the $70 million or $90 million is coming from, but it's going through a Goldman Sachs run Cayman Islands dummy account. So the money's being laundered through that, and since the election, this money's been somehow going into this Kushner company, who now he left the board and he divested down to 25%. Big deal. So he's not actively there, but he still has an active investment in it. So when you start looking at these money flows, you start to see the quid pro quo. These aren't, I don't know if you call them smoking guns, but they're significant tentacles.
Well, I mean, the obvious people to me, right when Trump won, that benefited was like Steve Mnuchin, and then the guy that was, what's his name?
Gary Cohn.
Yeah, Gary Cohn, and they actually, and then Wilbur Ross, and all three of these people were involved in financing Trump's campaign in one way or the other. Ross and Icahn supposedly got like $30 million into it. And all these people, they obviously benefit. They're in the administration in some form or another. But these connections are probably, in some ways, much more important, the ones you're talking about, because, there's Wall Street people, in the White House. Never happened before. It's not like a giant shift in policy where the stuff you're talking about is really impacting foreign policy.
Well, no, but it is important because Goldman Sachs think about CIA Director Bill Casey. So he's CIA Director at the beginning of the Reagan administration. I think I'm a big fan of Gary Sick's book, and I used to write for Robert Perry's website before he passed away, and Robert Perry did a lot of work on this. I think the October surprise story is factual, and I think that Bill Casey, when he was campaign director of Ronald Reagan in that 1980 election campaign, played a significant part, along with George Herbert Walker Bush and others, in setting up the deal to scuttle the release of hostages that Carter had negotiated with the Iranians, so that he wouldn't get that victory before a potential presidential victory, which would, I think, lead to a presidential victory, and then went on to become CIA director on the bona fides of pulling off this incredible coup. Well, and I use that term intentionally because I do think the 1980 election was, in a way, its own coup. But where was Casey? Casey used to be a Wall Street guy. And this gets back to that Venn diagram of what the real deep state is. And I'll give you an example on Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs gets to essentially, through its alumni, right, gets to control U.S. financial policy. They secure that $1 trillion+ tax gift for Wall Street and whatnot. But just Li Fang, the great Li Fang, if you're ever looking for reporting on the financial scumbaggery inside the Beltway, Li Fang is your guy. He's at The Intercept now. He used to be on his own, and then he did Nation for a while. Now he's at The Intercept. He reported just about 10 or 12, maybe 2 weeks ago, on a meeting held at Goldman Sachs headquarters, where the CEOs of Raytheon, which is just about to gobble up United Technologies, by the way, CEO of Lockheed, and all the CEOs of major defense companies got together to talk about their projections for increased defense spending given the rising tensions with Iran.
Mm.
And they're doing it at the Goldman Sachs headquarters. Why? Because the financial industry has tentacles, investment tentacles inside oil and inside defense. This is where the deep state is, folks. The deep state meets at Goldman Sachs headquarters. It does not meet in a cubicle on the third floor of the State Department.
Well, I didn't know this till I think last year, but you mentioned NSC 68, and that was in 1951, and it created the defense boom in the 1950s, the arms race.
Yep.
It, like, massively increased the defense budget. And I didn't, even though I wrote about that in this previous book I wrote, I didn't know this, that the actual people behind it was Averell Harriman and Wall Street, that they were the ones lobbying for this defense boom. It wasn't even being necessary. It wasn't the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but these guys. And the reason they were doing it was the Marshall Plan was coming to an end, and they saw the United States was going to have this budget surplus, an economic surplus, and they wanted to just spend it. And they knew that Wall Street could loan the money to do it too.
And
so,
and that to me is my sense of the deep state. So when I see the QAnon deep state and I see the Hannity deep state, not only is it a sort of a callow political ruse, but I think it's a deeply pernicious twofer. Because I don't know that Hannity knows he's doing this, but I think one of the most pernicious things about Trump's presidency is that he is actually creating a reality that is the opposite of the reality that he is promoting. He's creating for his devotees a complete alternate universe in which the very things he's doing, he is blaming on somebody else, so that it's the ultimate misdirection. And in a sense, Donald Trump is the best thing the deep state ever had. It's the same, it's kind of ironically, it's the same thing with the Kennedy assassination. The best thing that ever happened to the CIA in terms of the Kennedy assassination was the rise of conspiracy theories. Because eventually it gets to the point at which you can weaponize that thing that used to undermine you and use it to cover up your own crimes. And that's really what Donald Trump is doing for the deep state, in my humble opinion, because the deep state is thriving and is achieving a new level of power, particularly now that William Barr has gone into the administration and is bringing a much heftier and functional version of the unitary executive to Trump's presidency, and trying to enshrine now aspects of the unitary executive that were not even able to be enshrined under George W. Bush.
well, I mean, we go back to last summer as an example. That with that Judge Kavanaugh, who, was instrumental in creating the Patriot Act, or writing
Right.
it, or and so forth. And everyone, during the nomination, that's not talked about. Instead, it's about the cultural issues and whether or not he basically raped somebody or molested her, whatever he did.
And again, this gets back to my concern and why I was motivated to write this thing. And yes, this is curatorial journalism. That's what I do, is I curate. And if you get the rundown, you're going to see me curate the news cycle in a very unusual way. I pick a lot of different sources. I often have countervailing sources next to one another. But in this piece, I can't even count the number of hyperlinks I have. But everything that I say, every claim that I make, there is a hyperlink for you to check and find a source, and look at the source material yourself and check it. But I could tell you right now that there is a major game afoot, because the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are natural gas poor. They mostly have petroleum. Iran not only has enough oil that if they were to go to maximum production on oil, they could produce for 20 years. They also have the second largest proven natural gas reserve, Qatar has the third largest natural gas reserve. Russia by far has the largest, and natural gas is being pitched as a bridge fuel during a climate switchover, a climate helpful switchover from hydrocarbons to renewables. This is one of the things that Obama used to pitch fracking, and what fracking did is it totally destabilized the oil market to the point at which in his final year oil dropped to $26 a barrel at one point, and that's when the Saudis were unable to pay their civil servants, and the Russian economy was contracting by over 3%, and that was, I think, a seminal moment when this group that came to support Donald Trump, both before and then those who flooded in afterwards, because I think it is important to point that there were some people like, the guy at Lucas Oil who was supporting Trump all the way. There were some hydrocarbon mandarins who were supporting Trump. But once he got elected, and once it was obvious that his election was going to hold within the next first 5 or 6 days, that these people rushed in and they lavished money on his inauguration, for example, an inauguration that was run by a guy named Tom Barrack. Well, who's Tom Barrack? He's a billionaire who is a longtime Saudi fixer who was instrumental in trying to get the United States to release sensitive nuclear secrets to help Saudi Arabia build nuclear power plants. And this was one of the most expensive inaugurations in history, which is ironic because they did almost nothing. It's not like they had massive performances because nobody would show up to perform for them. And a lot of that money got cycled through Trump's properties. So it was a big money laundering operation. And whose money were they laundering? The defense industry, the oil industry, the Saudis, the Emiratis. There you go.
Well, you mentioned the one thing I wonder about is, and I go back and forth on this, like when I look at the issue of the tariffs, for example, is this, Trump's tariffs of China, and is this in other countries, is this really planned out with an end game, or just chaos where here's an issue that, he's getting some popularity with his base using it. He's got backers who want tariffs, but is there any real plan? And I wonder that with, say, the Iran issue, is there a plan beyond, you think, let's just get out of the nuclear deal with Iran, increase tensions, increase the price of oil, and create sort of chaos by doing that? Or do they really want to go to war? Or, I mean, where's this all going?
I don't think. I think it was interesting that even Netanyahu, when Bolton really got into his stride, caught his second win on Iran, I guess is the way to put it, and started marshaling forces into the Persian Gulf and really started to ratchet it up. Netanyahu receded a bit because I think in the long term, Netanyahu or the Likudists would love to see Iran toppled. I think they would be okay with some level of bombing if they thought bombing and an internal coordinated effort, by the Mujahideen al-Khalq or something, or some kind of surreptitious insurrection inside could be coupled together to topple the regime. But one of the things that Netanyahu's Israel, I should say, wanted more than anything, was to continue to ratchet down on sanctions to try and choke off the Iranian regime financially so that they cannot fund Hamas and Hezbollah. Because one of the problems that you face in attacking Iran is that unlike Iraq, Iran has proxies all over the place. So you're going to have a wave. I mean, you have a lot of military capability over the border in Lebanon, for example. So Israel I don't think really wants that war. I think maybe the United Arab Emirates, MBZ and MBS are a little hotter for it. But I think even them, the chaos is enough. I think the chaos and the sanctions are enough, because here's what the sanctions do. There are two things here. One, Iran was started to trade oil, right, with the sanction waivers and whatnot after the Iran nuclear deal. And Iran is sitting there on that sort of that time bomb. If they, like Iraq when under Saddam Hussein, If those reserves are opened up, then they can flood the market, right? If they decide to not go along with OPEC production cuts, they can make a stink in OPEC or whatever, or they could just leave OPEC, which Qatar has threatened to do. They can basically drive down the price of oil as a punitive measure against United Arab Emirates, against Saudi Arabia. The other problem is that even with where it is now, the world is so oversupplied. And oh, by the way, just today, story on oilprice.com, and there was another story on, I think it was maybe Reuters, two stories. One on how inside OPEC there are members of OPEC now who are unhappy with the deal that MBS and MBZ have cut with Putin, because now we don't have OPEC, we have OPEC Plus. OPEC Plus was a idea that Kirill Dmitriev predicted in 2016 before Trump was elected. After Trump was elected, Putin joined OPEC in OPEC Plus, where for the first time Russia was coordinating its production output with OPEC. They decided to reduce production, right, to try and drive up the price of oil. Then when all of the tensions happened with Iran, will he get in? Will he recertify? Won't he? Tillerson and Mattis convinced him to recertify. Another 90 days. Oh my God, the markets are full of tension. They're full of fear. What's going to happen? The price of oil, as you know, Mike, better than anybody. All you need is fears, market fears, and the price of oil will go up, right? Fears,
That's
even
right.
not just tensions, but fears of tensions will drive. So as the price of oil goes up and up and up, all the way to the crescendo of the nuclear deal, what is OPEC Plus able to do? Ratchet up production at a higher cost. So you reduce production to drive the price up. The tension keeps that price at a nice baseline. There was one big dip when the market crashed, but apart from that one big dip, I have the chart in the piece. You can see it's been a lot of honey, a lot of sugar for the oil producers, and then after the nuclear deal is pulled out and those tensions are relieved, what does he do next? They put sanctions on it to reduce further the amount of oil coming out, and they eliminate sanction waivers to countries like China. So we can come back to China, by the way, and the role China plays, because China is, by the way, this year will become the world's largest consumer of natural gas. Qatar is one of its largest producers, suppliers of natural gas. And could you imagine a pipeline from the world's largest gas field, which is shared by Qatar and Iran in the Persian Gulf? They share it. It's the Iranians call it the North Pars gas field. Imagine a pipeline from there through Afghanistan, if Afghanistan were ever to have the United States leave and it actually achieve some level of peace, and that pipeline heading straight into China to supply China with natural gas, thus completely eliminating the need for petroleum from the Middle East from countries not named Iran or Qatar. These are the big forces that are going on, these big energy forces that are behind all of this. And I think the question of how you control China's energy is the subtext to all of this. Now, I didn't get into that in this piece because I'm at 19,000 words, and you know what I mean? There's a point at which I didn't want to go down every single avenue. There are many avenues because I didn't really fully explore the Mercer thing, because I think that's where the Mercer, Bannon, Cambridge Analytica part of Trump's coalition is, and it merges with a section of the oil industry and the defense industry, which sees its long-term viability in competition with China, not in the Middle East, because I think they all know that the life of hydrocarbons is coming to an end. And so Donald Trump's job is to forestall the end of oil. Now, I'm not saying oil is going to end in a month or in 10 years, but in 20 years, oh yes. Look at what the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England are saying. They're talking about stranded assets. And as climate change goes from being an outlier in most Americans' mind to something they're experiencing on a daily basis, and America being the driver of petroleum consumption in the world, these are very, very important issues for Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, for oil companies and oil producers, for oil refiners, for the entire oil and defense infrastructure that has had the Middle East at the center of all of its profits.
Well, I mean, Saudi Arabia itself, they have something some plan they call Vision 2030, where they claim they want to not be dependent on oil profits to make money, and they're going to have a defense industry, like a giant hedge fund, and so forth. Try to be a technology hub, like have a megalopolis of something like San Francisco or one of these places.
So, Mike, how do you do that when Obama has smacked you upside the head with fracking and you can't pay your civil servants? How do you do it? How do you do it? Well, you know how you do it? The New York Times had an amazing piece on Mohammed bin Zayed. You actually sent it to me that morning as I was reading it, and I was like, "Oh, I've been scooped." Luckily, I wasn't totally scooped.
No,
I don't think.
no.
I was not scooped, but it turns out that Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, was actually playing a Game of Thrones game inside the Saudi kingdom to get Mohammed bin Salman the first among equals position, to try and promote him. And so he actually rode MBS in Saudi Arabia, and MBS and Kushner are the interface to U.S. policy. And what are we seeing with U.S. policy has been the most pro-Saudi policy you can imagine, not being run by a Bush. I mean, how is this? This is back to Hannity and deep state stuff. I guarantee you that the QAnon people and many of the sort of the conspiracy-minded people on the right do not particularly care for the Saudis. They probably all are 9/11 truthers to some extent, and the truth, the actual truth of 9/11 is that the Saudis were basically the people who were functionally coordinating it. I think that's been pretty much well established. And so here you have, and Trump's people are not Bush people, right? They didn't like the Bushes. That's one of the things that Trump played to great effect in the campaign, was going after the Iraq War as a big mistake, and the Bushes are terrible and all this stuff. But they do not realize that they have Bush on steroids in Donald Trump when it comes to oil, defense, and Saudi Arabia. It's maddening if you think about it, that they are literally seeing something white when it is black. It is the thing that they actually are fighting against is the thing that they are actually supporting by supporting the guy they think is fighting against that which they oppose.
Well, it's like a crazy.
I know.
Hall of mirrors, that phrase, but I mean it's even worse.
And so this is why I just had to go down this path with this piece, because I hadn't written anything on Trump since Robert Perry passed away. So that's 2 years ago, and it was also because the Mueller thing went on, and until the Mueller report came out, I felt there was very little to be said about Trump, because it was such a crucial aspect to it. And I read every single word of the Mueller report, and when I saw the Kirill Dmitriev stuff, that was the final thing that spurred it. It was like, now I can really get into this, because Dmitriev, he runs the Sovereign Wealth Fund. He is of Russia, closely connected to Putin, obviously, if you're running the Sovereign Wealth Fund of the nation. And he is a big promoter of the United Arab Emirates, and the day of Trump's election, he got a phone call from somebody, it's redacted in the report, that said, your boss has won. And within days, he's talking to a guy named Gerson. Gerson, does anybody know this guy Gerson? Well, read my story, because Gerson is a family friend of the Kushners. They have invested together in companies, and somehow Gerson is talking to Tony Blair on behalf of the...
And Putin too, right? Or Putin associates.
Between Trump and Putin.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, my gosh, this is insane. This is insane. I have to tell you, Kushner is the Where's Waldo of this story. He is in every picture, every single picture, every part of this. This guy is the power. This is the guy who is the... I'll give away, I think, one of my favorite lines in the thing is that Trump, I call him an all-you-can-grift buffet. And Kushner is the maitre d'. He's the guy who leads you to the buffet line, shows you what's on offer, hands you the plate, and you pay Kushner. And I think it's really stunning the extent to which this administration is corrupt. And I know you've looked at this a lot, Mike, over the years. I've looked at a lot of corruption. There was a lot of corruption in the Clinton administration, particularly Chinese donors and stuff. And then you have Walmart and the transfer of manufacturing base from China by corporations from the United States to China, and how the Clinton administration catalyzed that, and Chinese donors and all that. There's a lot there. Of course, the Iraq War was one of the great grifting opportunities in the history of mankind. The amount of money, pallets of cash going in. We don't know what happened to pallets of cash. And all the contractors that teamed around. Halliburton made so much money, Dick Cheney. But this one is so blatant and so in your face without any outrage coming, it seems to me, in the mainstream news cycle, that I find it the most disheartening of any of these corruption paradigms I've seen in my lifetime.
Well, I'm reading a book about Lyndon Johnson, and the thing about him is, I believe most of the corruption surrounding him was actually known by people before he was president. There were newspapers that wrote about it. There was an attack book written during the 1964 election that basically, if you go read these attack books on Lyndon Johnson today that Roger Stone and others wrote, they're just repeating these things that were already known way back then anyway. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why isn't, this doesn't seem to be that well known. Like you said, that the media isn't really commenting on it that much. It's all about Russia and Putin for the most part.
Well, I think
that's going on.
Well, there are two ways to look at it. It's either pernicious, because there are, when we talk about the deep state, you got to talk a little bit about the media, right? I mean, Project Mockingbird and whatnot. I've worked in the mainstream media, and I've been in D.C., and although I do believe there are people who are placed in agencies, that certain agencies, not just the CIA, but the NSA, place people in news agencies to get the desired effect. I think Walter Pincus. Come on, Walter Pincus was CIA, right? I mean, come on. I mean, you don't become a transmission point for the CIA without having a close relationship, that kind of stuff. But I think by and large, the monomaniacal obsession with both Russia and Trump's psychology, which I think is the other big distraction, is not based on the implementation of a pernicious plan, but it's really an outgrowth of the commodification of news, the drive for profits, and the inherent laziness of the business model, which it's so much easier to have people sitting around in a studio, some of which you don't have to pay because they are there to promote themselves, so you don't even have to pay some of them, to sit in a studio and give their opinions about a daily melodrama or soap opera instead of actually having somebody go out. This is 8 weeks of work on my part. So do they want somebody to go and do 8 weeks of work to produce 5 minutes of television when you can just have 8 people sit in a studio for an hour and give you an hour of television without ever having to send a camera crew or a news producer out anywhere? And so it's more profitable to keep doing the daily melodrama. Why? Because it's like reality television. It's like the World Wrestling Entertainment business that Donald Trump is a member. He's a member of their Hall of Fame for a reason. Because what you do is you have a daily soap opera that everybody tunes into, and it's very profitable, and your overhead is very low. That's what I really think is at the root of it.
Well, your piece, on one hand, all these details, and on one hand, it's very complicated because there's so much information that I was thinking at first, as you're saying this, that maybe this is actually too complicated for the average person, and therefore it wouldn't work on television. But no, that's not really true, because what you also do is all this information has a simple explanation, and that's the oily presidency, right?
That's
Uh,
it.
so, and this morning I read in the New York Times that they're going to stop doing editorial cartoons. Well, what if they all we need is editorial cartoons with Trump and these figures here, like you'd see back in the 1890s with the muckrakers or so forth, with the lobbyists and all this stuff. And Rockefeller, it's the same thing. Who's holding the strings here?
Right, Frank Norris and about the great octopus, right? That was controlling everything. We've been here before. I mean, you make the great analogy. We have been in this situation before, because I think the Gilded Age is a perfect corollary, which led to the progressive movement and the progressive age and trust busting. And what we see everywhere, you see it, Mike, monopolies everywhere. I mean, they are everywhere, and they are growing. Mergers and acquisitions. This is one of the ironies of the fracking thing, that Obama's fracking policy, is that it drove down the price of oil to a point at which it started to hurt frackers. And I think the Saudis in particular thought, well, we'll try and swallow this low price to drive frackers out of business. And they drove little ones, medium ones out of business, but they didn't drive the fracking business out of business. And all that happened is that the big companies gobbled up all the assets of the little companies and got more powerful. So when the price of oil rebounded, because the Saudis could not sustain a low price lest they collapse, by the way, which is one of the reasons why when MBS finally took power with the full faith and credit of the Trump administration backing him up and Mohammed bin Zayed backing him up, Mohammed bin Zayed's plan coming to fruition, he ran a shakedown operation to get $100 billion out of all the other Saudi princes who he beat in the Game of Thrones, because they needed cash. The Saudis needed cash, and the price of oil recovery that Donald Trump has delivered for them has allowed them to start following the plans that you talked about earlier. We thought I didn't finish. The only way you're going to get to Vision 2030 and to become a financial powerhouse and a tech powerhouse, and oh, by the way, they're building massive solar capacity, while the United States Donald Trump is saying renewables cause cancer. They're building renewables in Saudi Arabia, folks. Because this is the thing. You think Saudi Arabia is not doing a twofer all the time on the United States? They are. Well, there's a reason why Putin and MBS had that high five and a smile at the G20 when Donald Trump was slouched-shouldered coming in behind them, because they won, baby. They smacked the United States around big time, and for their own, in terms of their own ends. But the only way you're going to get there when you're unable to pay your civil servants because of what President Obama is doing to the oil market, and goading you into doing to the oil market at the same time, is to do what? Is to get a massive sustained increase in the price of oil, to get a regime change inside the regime with a new leader who is willing to extract money from the other princes, and get the runway, the capital runway you need over the next 10 years, or at least over the next 4 to 8 years, if there's a re-election of Donald Trump, an 8-year process. You need to hoard as much money as you can to make that vision come true, because Vision 2030 was never going to happen without the election of Donald Trump.
Well, they're betting the future of their whole kingdom on it.
They
really.
have to. Yeah. They have to. Because I can tell you this, Oil Minister Al Naimi, there were, I think WikiLeaks actually released these cables. There were some diplomatic cables. And during Obama's presidency, Al Naimi was sending messages around to his own people and to State Department officials saying, we know that peak oil is actually not the problem. We are worried about peak demand. That inflection point when the demand for oil will start to decline precipitously over time. Now I've seen, the latest thing I saw was that their analysts are thinking that we might reach peak demand in 2020. And if we have another market crash, where we're in a market, I don't know, what would you call this market? It's kind of a zombie market right now.
Yeah, it's a zombie market for sure, but it's got some wild distortions.
wild distortion. But basically, one of the things that's happening is that even things like electric cars, I know people say they're not really carbon neutral. Yeah, but if your power plant is running off of natural gas and your cars are running off of electric, what are you eliminating? Petroleum. You're eliminating petroleum. You might not be eliminating hydrocarbons, but you could eliminate petroleum. And so they were worried about peak demand 8 years ago. 8 years ago they saw it. And so if you don't think the Gulf Arabs have known, or that oil companies have known that this is coming, and you don't think that they've wanted climate denialism to try and dampen the acceleration of the call to eliminate hydrocarbons, you're kidding yourself. It's simple. You're right. It is simple. It's always money, and oil is money. And they need time to extract as much money out of oil as they can before oil becomes a toxic, stranded asset.
Well, if I remember, I'm correct. I'm verifying this when I say this. Saudi Arabia was the very first country Trump even visited on May the 20th. The very first one.
Yes.
And that tells you a lot right there.
Dancing swords, baby. Dancing swords.
If anyone listening wants to know why, I mean, we've pretty much explained it, but go and read the article, and I'll link to it at the bottom of this video, and subscribe to JP's email list, because I get it every single day, and I look at it every single morning. But as we wrap up, is there anything you want to add? Or
No, I do. I know. I'm sorry, folks. I wrote a lot. I indulged myself. There are a couple jokes in there, a couple little Easter eggs. If you click on a link here and there, where you'll have a nice little break, something entertaining. But I felt it had to be laid out in full, and I commend anybody who is willing to read it through to the end. I appreciate you greatly.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me and everyone else, and we'll keep in touch.
Take care, Mike.